The rain had been falling for hours, not in torrents, but in a steady, unrelenting hush, as if the sky were mourning in quiet solidarity with the woman who staggered to the forest beneath it. Maris moved like a creature already half dead, her feet slick with mud, her shift clinging wet and heavy to her legs, her breath sharp and shallow. The trees above her loomed in bent silhouettes, their limbs arched like sorrowful witnesses, and the wind threaded through them with a whispering voice that seemed to echo her own name. She had stopped counting how many days had passed since she had fled. Her world had become narrowed to pain, hunger, and the rhythmic agony that now clutched at her lower spine in waves that left her shaking. She was too far gone to pray, too tired to plead. Her only remaining instinct was to keep moving, to put distance between her and the village that had cast her out. But her body, betraying her finally, buckled beneath the weight of what it had carried alone. She collapsed near the roots of a hemlock, its gnarled branches shielding her from the worst of the rain. Her knees hit the earth hard, and she gasped, not from the impact, but from a sudden surge within her that tore through her belly like fire. A contraction, stronger than the others. Her fingers dug into the moss and wet leaves, clutching the forest floor as if it could anchor her against the tide of pain. The forest was vast and indifferent, but bore silent witness as she gave in to the inevitability of birth. There were no hands to guide her, no warm cloths, no whispered words of encouragement, only the breathless night, the rustling trees, and the dull ache of loneliness that had rooted itself so deeply in her chest she could no longer tell where it ended and she began. The child came swiftly and not without blood. The silence after was complete. For one terrible moment, Maris could not move. Her arms, shaking, lifted the limp, wet bundle from between her legs, her mind hollow with terror. The infant's skin was too pale, its mouth slack, its chest unmoving. She pressed the child to her chest, rocking, whispering words she did not remember forming. Her hands trembled as she wiped away the blood and fluid, and then she tapped gently, frantically at the tiny back, her vision swimming with exhaustion and fear. The world had grown so quiet it seemed she had been swallowed by death itself. Then a sound, small, cracked, a gasp, like air drawn after drowning. The child cried, weak but alive, and Maris wept without sound. She had not known she still possessed the strength to cry, but the tears came nonetheless, slipping down her cheeks and mingling with the rain. Her body slumped forward, folding around her daughter, shielding the newborn with her own heat as best she could. She was shaking, cold and spent, the world around her dimming at the edges. She whispered a string of thank yous, not to God, not to the saints, but to the child herself, for choosing to live, for tethering her back to the earth at a moment when she might otherwise have slipped away entirely. The horses came slowly. She heard them first, the low thud of hooves muffled by the sodden forest floor. Her head lifted, dazed, and she pulled her child closer, already half preparing to run despite the impossibility of it. But she could not move. Her legs had gone numb. Her muscles refused her. The wind carried the sound of armor, of leather creaking and metal shifting. A rider dismounted, and through the curtain of rain, he approached her, the glint of a sword hilt at his hip, a gray cloak, soaked to the hem, a face shadowed beneath a dented steel helm. She stared up at him, her eyes wide with the remnants of panic, her arms wrapped tightly around the infant. He knelt, not as one might kneel to a queen or to a saint, but slowly, like someone offering stillness in place of threat. He removed his helmet. His face was weathered, lined not by age but by burden, eyes sunken from sleeplessness, mouth taut with restrained concern. He did not ask who she was. He did not ask what she had done to end up alone, bloodied, and shaking in the woods. Instead, he shrugged off his heavy cloak and draped it around her shoulders with gentleness that made her want to recoil and surrender in equal measure. He offered her a skin of water, which she accepted with trembling hands, drinking just enough to wet her cracked lips. He did not speak for some time. He merely looked at her, not as a spectacle, not as a sinner or a stray, but as a woman who had just passed through something sacred and harrowing alone. "My horse is strong," he said at last, his voice low and rough. "He can carry you both." Maris tried to answer, but could not form the words. Her throat was raw, her body beyond speech. She only looked at him, uncertain whether to trust whether this was kindness or a trap. The man must have seen the fear in her eyes, because he added, "There's a lodge. Empty. A day's ride north. Hunters use it once, but no one's touched it since the snows." He did not ask again. Instead, he moved slowly, carefully, arranging his horse's saddle, placing furs across the seat. Then, returning to her side, he extended his arms. She hesitated. The baby stirred, whimpered softly against her chest. Her arms tightened. For a moment, it was as if the forest held its breath. "I won't harm her," he said, not as a promise but as a truth already lived. And perhaps it was exhaustion, or something in his voice. Or maybe she had simply run out of places to hide. But she nodded. He lifted her easily, with the kind of strength that came not from youth but from necessity. Cradling both mother and child, he carried them to his mount and settled them as gently as he could. The warmth of the horse beneath her, the thick cloak now wrapped around her twice, the steady presence of man beside her, these things began to press the fear from her limbs. She did not know what he expected. She had nothing to offer him. No name, no past, no future worth sharing. As they rode through the dripping woods, branches bowed beneath the weight of rain. She rested her cheek against his back. Her arms curled protectively around a child nestled between them. The motion lulled her towards sleep, but part of her remained awake, listening to the rhythm of hoofbeats, the occasional grunt of the horse, the wind threading through the leaves like a lullaby. The forest no longer felt like a place of exile. Not entirely. Beneath the sorrow, a small seed of safety had been planted. She did not know the knight's name. Not yet. She did not know what he wanted from the world or from her. But in that moment, he was simply warmth and strength and silence. 3 things she had gone too long without. And though she could not yet trust, she could allow herself to rest. Just for a while. Just long enough to breathe again. The child at her chest stirred once more, seeking her with tiny, searching fingers. She pressed her lips to her daughter's forehead, still warm despite the cold, and closed her eyes. The knight said nothing more. He rode until the sky lightened in the east and the trees began to thin. Only then did he speak again, not to her, but to the horse, murmuring something low and familiar. A name, perhaps, a command. It didn't matter. What mattered was that he did not leave her behind. He could have, but he didn't. He had seen her, ragged, broken, a stranger with a child, and he had not walked away. The lodge revealed itself not as a structure, but first as a smell, mildew, wet bark, and a long, settled muss of animal dust. It stood at the edge of a clearing where sunlight filtered through broken boughs and made dappled ghosts upon the mossy floor. Moss curled up the stones of its chimney and roof, and the door hung slightly off its hinge, giving the impression of abandonment, not collapse. When the knight, Calred, though she would not know that name yet, helped her down from the saddle, her legs folded under her, and he caught her again without a word. The child stirred weakly in her arms, her face furrowed with the confusion of new breath, and Maris felt the old panic swell in her chest, that she had no place to offer, no cradle to lay her in, no safe haven, no fire, only her body, still shaking, and the uncertain shelter of a man she had not chosen. But he said nothing. He lifted the latch with one practiced hand, shouldered the crooked door open, and stepped aside to let her pass before him. She paused on the threshold, uncertain, breathing in the scent of disuse and damp wood, and saw a hearthstone dark with soot, a pile of broken kindling, and one sturdy table with a bench long enough for 2 to sleep if it came to that. No windows, only slits beneath the eaves. Dust caught the morning light like smoke. Still, there was shelter. Still, there was a roof. Calred stepped past her and placed a fur-lined bedroll near the hearth. He moved with soldier's economy, his armor clinking softly as he unbuckled the chest plate and set it aside, revealing a tunic darkened with rain and the wear of long travel. Maris stood with the child against her chest, too cold to think, too stunned to speak. The pain had not left her entirely, but it dulled in the warmth now slowly beginning to rise in the room as he kindled a small fire with the driest wood he could find. She watched his hands, broad, scarred, surprisingly gentle, as he coaxed flame from flint, each spark a promise she did not yet believe. He did not ask her to sit, but she lowered herself carefully onto the bedroll. shifting the child against her breast, where Ellen latched with a hunger that startled her. The relief of it made her breath catch. She closed her eyes as warmth seeped into her bones, and her daughter drank in tiny, greedy gulps. The fire cracked. The knight moved behind her, setting a pot near the flame and pouring water from his saddle skin, adding a handful of bark and something that smelled faintly of mint and ash. He did not speak, nor did she. The room was filled with the sounds of survival, the soft click of metal, the whisper of steam, the slow settling of wood. Hours passed without the measure of them. Time folded inward. When the child slept, Maris let herself sleep, too, her body curling protectively around the infant, her mind spiraling into a sleep too deep for dreams. When she woke, the fire had burned low, and the knight was sharpening his sword in the corner, the sound low and methodical, a rhythm she found oddly soothing. She did not ask his name. She did not want to offer hers. Names had weight. Names were doorways, and she had closed every one behind her the night she fled Thornwood. The days that followed slipped into a rhythm that owed nothing to speech and everything to necessity. Calred left each morning without explanation, returning by dusk with berries, small game, bundles of herbs she recognized from the gardens of her childhood. He cleaned fish with quiet efficiency, boiled roots into mash, laid traps with clever precision. Sometimes you watch him to the gap in the lodge door, the silhouette of him moving through ferns and fog, as though he belonged to the woods in a way she never could. He did not ask questions. He did not try to sit beside her unless he was tending to the fire or arranging the food between them. And still, each time he came back, her breath loosened. She could not name the shape of that feeling, only that it grew. She began to speak in small pieces. One evening, as Ellen slept curled like a seed in the crook of her arm, Maris asked, "Why did you stop?" The firelight made shadows of his face, deepening the hollows beneath his cheekbones. He did not look up from the arrowhead he was carving. "I heard her cry," he said simply, "and there was no one else." She did not press further. The truth, she sensed, was not in what he said, but in what he chose not to say. There was grief around him like a second cloak. She recognized it. She wore it, too. On the fourth day, she asked his name. He glanced up briefly, then said, "Calred." The syllables felt solid, unadorned, like the man himself. She offered nothing in return. He did not seem to expect it. Instead, he handed her a bundle of dried moss and cloth for the child's cradle, then turned back to fire. It was that night she named the baby. She had been turning names over in her mind for days, trying each like a stone in her palm, rejecting those that felt too burdened with memory, too soft, too sharp. But as she held the child close and watched Calred lean back against the far wall with the ease of someone who had stopped guarding his posture, the name came to her. "Ellen," she said aloud, testing it. The child stirred, as if hearing and claiming it. Calred's eyes met hers across the firelight. He nodded once, and something in the room settled. Ellen. It meant light, or ash tree, depending on the tongue. She chose it for both. A name that held strength and memory. A name without ties to Thornwood or the father who had vanished like mist. A name that felt earned. After that, the silence between them changed. Not filled exactly, but softened. He began to speak in fragments, about the war in the southern provinces, about a brother lost to fire, about a commander who'd led them into a slaughtered valley and never came back. He spoke without anger, only weariness. A man unmoored by grief, wandering not for victory or glory, but because there was nowhere else to go. She listened because it cost him something to say the words, and because her own story had become too heavy to carry alone. She told him nothing of Thornwood. Not yet. Now the priest who had placed his cold hands on her belly and called it cursed. Now the way the women turned their backs when she passed. How they whispered the word, which was a mix of fear and pleasure. Now the night she ran, her stomach heavy, her hands shaking, a single loaf of bread hidden beneath her shawl. That story was still too raw, too close. Instead, she asked him whether he missed the war. He laughed, the sound low and surprised, as if he hadn't heard it in years. "No," he said, "but I miss the men, the quiet in their company." She understood that. There was a kind of quiet between them now, 2, and not a cold one. One morning, before he left again, he returned to the doorway, paused, and looked at her as she rocked the sleeping Ellen. "There are wolves further north," he said. "Stay close. I'll be back before the light fades." She nodded when the door closed behind him. She reached for the carving knife he had left near the hearth and began shaving a piece of pine. She did not know yet what would become, a cradle perhaps, or a doll, but she needed her hands to remember purpose. She worked slowly, her stitches tighter now, her hunger no longer hollow but rising again with each breath. Each evening he returned, and each morning he left, and between these bookends of comings and goings, a life began to form, not safe, not certain, but real. There was no promise, only presence, and for the first time and longer than she could remember, that was enough. The forest had begun to change, slowly and almost imperceptibly at first, the way grief loosens its hold only after countless, quiet days. What had once an oppressive silence now felt like privacy. The wind no longer seemed to follow Maris like a warning, but instead hummed softly in the trees like a lullaby too old to trace back to a source. The mornings arrived with a hush of frost clinging to the ferns, and though the sun still fought its way through the canopy in reluctant shafts, the light lingered longer with each passing day. In this quiet stretch of time, Ellen's cries had grown stronger, less like pleas for life and more like declarations of it. Her eyes had darkened from cloudy blue to the quiet gray of river stone, and her fists waved in the air with a willfulness that made Maris both ache and laugh. Each evening, Cal had returned with dirt under his nails, the scent of wild onions or fish lingering in his cloak, and each evening Maris handed him a bowl or a cup or a glance with slightly less guardedness than the day before. There were no roles to speak of, no conversations about who would do what, and yet the rhythm of their days took on the shape of a life shared. Calred repaired the lodge one section at a time, patching the roof with branches and bark, reinforcing the beams with pine he carried in from the forest, dragging stone from the riverbed to shore up the hearth. Maris mended blankets with thread pulled from old seams, stitched together a sling from torn linen to carry Ellen while she worked, and began, slowly, to tend the patch of earth behind the lodge where some stubborn herbs had survived the winter. She discovered yarrow, mint, and a coarse-leaf dock she remembered her mother using to treat burns. It steadied her to see the plants come back from snow, to remember that some things knew how to return even after the cold had taken everything. One evening, as the sun settled in pale bruises along the horizon and smoke curled from the chimney like a quiet flag, Calred came back with a book. Maris was feeding Ellen by the fire, her shawl drawn over her shoulder, her hair pinned back with a twig. She looked up when he stepped through the doorway, noting the smear of ash on his cheek and the stiff way he held his arm. He had not been to the river or to his traps. He had been further, she could tell. Before she could ask, he reached into the folds of his cloak and withdrew the thin, leather-bound volume, setting it on the table with an expression that was almost sheepish. "From the Abbey ruins," he said. "They burned the roof, but the stone held. Most of the pages are wet, but some are still readable." Maris hesitated before reaching for it. The leather was warped, the spine brittle, and as she opened it, a few flakes of mold-stained paper fluttered to the table. Inside, the ink had bled in places, but she could still make out the shapes of music. Lullabies, written in simple script, surrounded by faint, ghost-like notes. She ran her fingers along the page as if to confirm it was real. "I remember this one," she murmured, pointing to a fragment. "My mother sang it." The words came back to her slowly, not in full, but in tones and half-phrases, and that night she sang them into Ellen's hair as the child drifted to sleep, her small fist wrapped around a strand of Maris's loose braid. Calred listened without speaking, sitting with one knee drawn up, his eyes half-shadowed. When the fire burned low and the baby had gone still, Maris looked over at him, the silence thick between them. "Thank you," she said, the words as fragile and deliberate as prayer. After that, there were more words between them, not yet personal ones, but shared thoughts about the world beyond the trees. Calred told her about the war, though not in the way the village men used to, boasting, naming heroes, repeating legends. He spoke of long marches, of nights so cold even the horses gave up and laid down in the snow. He He spoke of hunger that turned men into ghosts and of brothers who stopped speaking, not out of anger, but because speech had lost all purpose. He never named the cause they had fought for, and Maris never asked. She understood that whatever banner he once rode under had ceased to matter the moment the fires reached his family's land. The only name he ever spoke was his brother's, Tehran, whispered once in a sentence that trailed into silence. She did not tell him her story, but one morning, she dreamed again of Thornwood, and when she awoke, her hands were clenched so tightly around the edge of the blanket that her knuckles had gone white. She got up without waking Ellen, and went outside to where the early mist still clung to the clearing. The cold bit through her shawl, but she welcomed it, needed it. She stood barefoot in the dirt and tried to remember the names of the women who had stood in the church with her the night of the blessing. She could not recall a single one, only to feel the priest's voice, oily and warm as it slid across her skin, and the way of the town's eyes as they watched her kneel, already marked as fallen. Later that day, smoke rose beyond the trees, a thin black ribbon, far enough away not to pose an immediate threat, but close enough to see. Maris froze at the sight, her breath catching in her throat. She stared at it until Calred stepped up beside her. He followed her gaze and did not speak for a long while. Then quietly he said, "That's not from any of my fires." Her hands trembled slightly. "Thornwood?" she asked. "Could be." She could feel the old panic, like a second heart inside her chest, pulsing with dread. The idea that Thornwood still existed, that its breath still fumed into the sky, that those who had condemned her walked among the living, burned with cruel contradiction. She had wanted to be forgotten, erased from their world. But now, seeing that smoke, she understood the truth more plainly than ever. Forgetting had never been hers to choose. She turned to Calred. Her voice was low. "Don't ask me why I ran." He looked at her then, fully, the line of his brow unmoving, but something in his eyes shifted. He did not ask. He only said, "You're not going back." She nodded, though the weight of the statement pressed down on her with the force of a buried root. That night, when Ellen woke crying and Maris could not soothe her, Calred took the child in his arms without hesitation. He held her close to his chest, humming tunelessly, pacing the small space of the lodge in a slow, looping pattern. Maris watched, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her heart aching with something she could not name. Not longing, exactly, not jealousy. Something softer, something more frightening. When Ellen finally settled, Calred returned her without a word and sat by the fire. Maris sat beside him, their shoulders close, not touching. The flame snapped softly, casting orange light across the stone. For a long time, neither spoke. Then, almost without realizing she was saying it, Maris whispered, "She was born under trees. No roof, no prayers, just earth and wind and me." Calred nodded slowly, looking into the fire. "Then she was born stronger than most." The words settled deep, not as flattery but as fact. And for the first time since she had left Thornwood, Maris let herself believe it might be true. The memory returned not like a storm, sudden and violent, but like a slow-rising tide that crept up her throat and filled her lungs before she could stop it. It came on a morning when the fire was low and Ellen had fallen back into sleep after her first stirring. The lodge smelled faintly of wood smoke and damp wool, and outside the air was thick with the ache of distant thunder. Maris sat by the hearth with her knees drawn up, a rough-spun blanket clutched around her shoulders, her hair falling loose over one collarbone. Calred had gone early, following the trail of a wounded deer he had glimpsed the day before. There was no sound in the lodge but the soft creak of the timbers and the occasional murmur of wind through the chinks in the wall. It was in that hush that Thornwood came back to her, not as it was in daylight, with its market square and its crooked roof lines and its gossiping windows, but in the shape of its church, gray and narrow and cold as bone. She saw herself inside it, kneeling on the hard stone floor, her belly already heavy, her palms pressed together in desperate supplication. The walls had smelled of mildew and beeswax, and the candlelight flickered as though even the flames hesitated to bear witness. The priest stood over her in his dark robe, his lips moving with well-rehearsed disdain, and his eyes never once touched her face. They stayed fixed on her stomach, on the slight curve beneath her apron. "You bring shame," he had said, not shouting, not dramatic, but quiet, measured, like someone delivering a diagnosis. "You come seeking sanctity while carrying the evidence of sin." His hands, too smooth, too white, had made the sign of the cross not above her, but away from her, as though to keep her from staining it. She had not spoken, not even to defend herself. Her voice had deserted her in the days since Oren disappeared, and the silence had become a part of her, a shield she wore like second skin. She had loved Oren with the kind of belief that belonged only to the very young and the very desperate. He was a stable boy with the dark hair and the quick laugh who had slipped her apples when she scrubbed the convent steps and whispered that he would take her to the coast someday, where the sea opened like a promise. She had believed him not because his words were grand, but because he had said them with his hands dirty and his boots wet, and something in that groundedness had made her feel real. They had met in the hayloft once a week, always just after sunset, always with her heart pounding and her future unspoken between them. He had kissed her with reverence. He had touched her with care. And when she told him she was late, he had kissed her forehead and said, "We'll leave before the frost comes. Just you wait." But he never came back after that. She waited 3 nights beneath the tree behind the chapel, her hands folded over her stomach, her breath white in the dark. On the 4th night, she went to the priest. She did not know why. Perhaps to beg for mercy. Perhaps to confess the sin they said she carried. Perhaps to speak aloud the truth she had swallowed. Instead, she was handed judgment like a bucket of cold water, without weight or warmth, and sent from the church with her name already unwritten from its books. After that, the whispers began. The village was not cruel in the way wolves are cruel. It was worse. It was indifferent in the way that people become when they have chosen not to see. The baker's wife stopped giving her stale loaves. The laundress left her water bucket, overturned by the well. No one raised a hand against her, but no one met her eyes, either. And when the belly grew, when the spring rains began and she started walking with one hand always at her back, the silence broke into accusation. She heard which hissed behind closed shutters. She heard whore in the scrape of feet on stone when she passed. It did not matter that she had never touched a charm or a curse. It did not matter that she still lit candles at the shrine for her mother's soul. Her belly was proof. Her silence was guilt. And when the child kicked inside her, it felt not like a promise anymore, but a warning. The breaking point came not with violence, but with something colder. One morning she found a small packet of herbs she kept, chamomile, valerian, sage, scattered and burned outside her door. Her window had been broken in the night. Nothing taken, nothing spoken. Just broken glass and ashes and the sound of footsteps fading into the dark. She wrapped what she could in linen, took the last of her bread, and walked into the forest before the sun could rise. She did not know then where she meant to go, only that she could not stay, not and keep the child alive. Now, in the quiet lodge far from that world, the memory pressed against her chest like a bruise. She looked down at Ellen, sleeping with her thumb curled near her lip, and felt a fierce, shivering protectiveness rise in her throat. There had been a moment, only one brief and poisoned, when she had thought of burying the child before it could be born. When the fear had become so dense she could no longer see through it. When the voices of the village had become louder than her own, she had stood at the edge of the woods with a stone in her hand and a prayer of erasure on her lips. But the child had moved. A single, sharp kick beneath her ribs, and something in her had cracked open. A refusal, a spark. She had dropped the stone. She had turned away. The lodge door opened slowly behind her, and Coward entered, his cloak wet and his boots streaked with mud. She did not turn. He moved with the same care he always did when she was in these quiet states, and when he sat beside her, he did not speak. For a long time, they stared into the fire. Then, finally, they said she would be born cursed, that the devil had marked her. Her voice did not shake, though her fingers did. Coward's expression did not change, but his gaze shifted toward Ellen. "She doesn't look cursed to me," he said simply. Maris laughed, the sound bitter and brief. "They said my mother used to speak to animals, that she danced in the woods alone. She sang to the moon when her husband died. It was enough. They needed only a reason. They always do." She turned to him. What if they come here? Will they find us? They won't, he said, but not with the careless certainty of a man trying to reassure. His voice was low, calm, grounded in the kind of knowledge that came from experience. But if they do, they won't take her. There was no arrogance in the way he said it, just quiet conviction. A man who had lost too much to promises but still believed in action. She studied him then, not his face, which was worn and familiar now, but the lines in his hands, the old scars that ran along his knuckles and wrist, the way he always stood slightly turned, as if still expecting a blade from behind. This was not a man who offered protection easily, but he offered it now. Maris reached out, not thinking, and laid her hand lightly over his. His fingers tensed, then slowly, without flourish, turned to close around hers. They sat like that for a long time. No vows, no names exchanged, only warmth and trust, brittle and slow, begin to take shape between them like ice forming in thaw. She did not tell him everything. Not yet, but she had offered him her past in pieces, and he had not looked away. That night, when the fire burned low and the storm finally broke overhead, Maris stood at the doorway, Ellen sleeping against her shoulder. She looked into the darkness beyond the clearing, into the trees that had once frightened her, and felt a strange, aching sense of peace. She did not belong to Thornwood anymore. She did not belong to its judgment, its memory, its fire. She belonged to the child who had lived, and, in some strange way she did not yet understand, to the man who had not asked her to be anything but what she was when he found her. The days passed in a quiet rhythm that did not announce itself but settled over them gradually, like mist collecting on pine needles or dust gathering along a windowsill. Ellen began to laugh, not in fits or bursts but in soft, delighted squeals that bloomed out of her like spring petals cracking frost. It was not always clear what made her laugh. Sometimes it was a flicker of flame, the rustle of wind, the scrape of Card's boots across the floor. But each time she did, it reached through the silence and made something inside Maris loosen. The sound held no memory of Thornwood. It belonged to the woods, to the present, to the lodge that now carried the scent of boiled roots and old smoke and the sweet, faint musk of milk-warm baby skin. The walls had been patched in the corners with thick pine boughs. The draft through the floorboards was quieter. Calred had added another layer of stone to the hearth, and the heat held longer into the night. Maris began to hum when she cooked, absent-minded and low. Old songs that had no words, just sounds passed down from her mother and her mother's mother before that. She tied herbs in bundles over the doorway to dry, lined up jars of wild garlic and yarrow root, folded cloth scraps into a small wooden chest they had found abandoned behind a lodge, and every morning she stepped outside with Ellen in her arms and let the child look at the world with wide, wondering eyes. The forest was still dense and shadowed, but it no longer felt like a prison. It had become the walls of a different kind of chapel, silent, solemn, and unjudging. Each evening, Calred returned with something new: dried lichen, bird feathers, a strip of fur, once even a rusted pendant on a leather cord, which he handed to Ellen as if presenting it to a queen. She took it with both fists and gummed it with complete devotion, her gray eyes full of the kind of trust Maris had never known as a child. It was Calred who found the broken cart in a dry creek bed and stripped it of wood and iron nails. Calred who climbed the old birch tree to retrieve a fallen squirrel's nest so Ellen could feel the texture of moss in her hands. Calred who fashioned a cradle from cedar limbs and smoothed it with oil until it gleamed faintly in the firelight. He did these things without comment, as if the labor itself was enough, as if building something was the only way he still knew how to love. Maris noticed the way his voice had softened. He still spoke with the blunt economy of a soldier, but now his words curved slightly when he addressed a child, and sometimes, rarely, when he spoke to her. He had stopped keeping his sword within arm's reach at night. He had started leaving his boots near the hearth. And yet, for all these signs of rootedness, there remained a hesitation in him, a quiet folding inward that came especially in the dusk hours, when the light slanted orange through the gaps in the roof and the air grew heavy with the scent of ash and memory. Maris had learned to read the silence by then. She could tell when his thoughts slipped away from the lodge and into some distant valley or burned-out field. When he drifted too far, she placed Ellen in his arms and turned to her tasks, letting the weight of the child pull him back into the room. One evening, As the fire was burning low and the last of the light had sunk behind the trees, Cal had returned with a book, a real one, not just pages torn from ruin, but full, bound volume with leather cracked at the spine and gold flecks still clinging to the edges. He said nothing as he handed it to her, only watched as she opened the cover and ran her fingers over the names scrawled inside. Lullabies for Winter, it read. The script was careful, and beneath it, in smaller, almost childlike letters, to Clara, who sings even when there is no one to listen. Maris closed the book gently, her throat tightening. She said thank you with her eyes, not trusting her voice to carry the shape of it. Later, as Ellen slept and the wind picked up outside, whistling to the tall trees like a voice long forgotten, they sat by the fire together, closer than usual, their arms brushing when they reached for their bowls. Calred poured her tea. Their fingers touched once on the wooden handle. He pulled away, quickly, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his face. She didn't speak. Neither did he, but the air changed after that, thicker, expectant. That night, when she dreamed, she saw a sea she had never touched, gray and endless, with a boat floating empty just beyond the breakers. She stood on the shore, Ellen in her arms, and waited for something to appear on the horizon. Nothing did, but she felt no fear, only a strange, deep quiet, as if waiting itself was a purpose. In the morning, Calred was gone, not late returning, not down by the traps or gathering firewood, simply gone. His sword was missing, so was his cloak. He had left no note, no mark. Only the fire had been tended, would stack neatly beside it, water in the basin changed, the last apple cut into pieces and left near the cradle. Maris stood in the doorway and stared at the empty clearing, her heart thudding in a slow, unfamiliar rhythm. Not panic, not yet, but something older, something like the memory of abandonment. The first day, she said nothing aloud, only moved to the routine as if repetition could shield her. She boiled lentils, sang to Ellen, scrubbed the floor with fir needles. At dusk, she lit the lamp and placed it near the window slit, in case he had lost his way. On the second day, she walked to the edge of the clearing and waited, listening for hoofbeats, for the creak of leather, for the sound of a man breathing. The woods gave her nothing. That night, she dreamed of Thornwood again, but this time she stood outside the church, looking in, and the doors would not open. She banged and begged, and no one came. Ellen cried in her arms, and she could not soothe her. By the third day, she began to whisper curses beneath her breath. Not real ones, just words that carried the rhythm of fury. She fed Ellen with one hand and pounded dough with the other, hard and fast, as if violence could summon him. That night, she placed the cradle closer to the fire, pulled Ellen into her lap, and wrapped them both in every spare blanket she could find. She stared at the door until sleep overtook her. On the fourth morning, she found the note, folded beneath a stone near the edge of the woodpile, tucked in the place where he knew she gathered kindling. The parchment was rough, the ink smeared slightly from the dew. It said only, "I will return." No explanation, no apology, nothing to anchor her worry or ease her breath. Just a sentence, plain and spare. Yet she read it a dozen times, as if more meaning might reveal itself in the spaces between the letters. She hated him for it, for the silence, for the leaving, for making her remember what it felt like to wait for a man who might never come back. And still, each evening, she walked to the edge of the clearing. She held Ellen close, bundled her tight, and watched the shadows lengthen along the trees. She whispered lullabies from the book he had given her. She mended his torn sleeve with new thread. She lit the lamp. In those quiet days, she learned something else. She did not need him to live. She could carry the child, split the wood, gather herbs and water, cook and clean in comfort. But she also learned this. She wanted him to come back, not because he made life easier, but because with him, life had begun to feel like more than survival. It had begun to feel like something unfolding, slow and tender, like moss spreading along stone or sap rising through bark. Not fast, not certain, but real. On the seventh morning, she woke before dawn and found the fire already lit. Calred sat beside it, his face haggard, a bruise darkening one temple, the hem of his cloak torn. He looked up when she stepped into the room. Ellen nestled against her chest, and in his eyes she saw not shame or excuse, but relief. He stood slowly, stiffly, and she crossed the room in silence, standing before him with every breath she had gathered over the long days he was gone. "I thought you'd gone like the others," she said, voice low, almost breaking. "I almost did," he answered, and for a moment that was all. Then he reached out, his hand hovering above Ellen's head, and she did not stop him when he touched her cheek with the back of his fingers. The child sighed in her sleep. "You came back," Maris whispered, and in her chest something shifted, something fragile and long denied, something like hope taking root where once there had only been ash. It was early spring when the man first appeared, though the forest had not yet fully shed the chill of winter. The air still carried the bite of frost in the mornings, and the trees remained mostly bare, their branches skeletal against the gray sky. The earth had begun to soften, just enough to release its scents, the pungent sweetness of thawing bark, the sharp breath of wet stone. Birds had returned in cautious flocks, their songs tentative as if testing whether it was safe to announce joy. In the clearing, the lodge stood quiet, smoke trailing from the chimney in a lazy ribbon, and inside, Maris knelt over the hearth with Ellen balanced on one hip, her small hand wrapped around a carved spoon. The child had begun to babble, strings of sound without shape, yet full of intention, and Maris listened with a kind of reverence, responding softly as she stirred the pot, anchoring the day in warmth and rhythm. Calred had gone out before dawn, speaking little, though he had kissed Ellen's forehead and placed a hand on Maris's back as he passed. He was not a man of easy affection, but since returning from his week of absence, something had changed between them. Some door cracked open, some boundary no longer patrolled. They had not spoken of what happened in his days away, but the silence between them no longer felt like avoidance. It felt like understanding. Maris heard the footsteps before she saw him, not Calred's. Calred walked with a deliberate, even pace, his steps heavy, each one marking presence. These steps were lighter, but lacked the quiet humility of a hunter. They belonged to someone enused of woods, someone who walked not to blend but to be noticed. Ellen fell silent, her body tensing slightly, as if her small instincts recognized something before Maris's mind had caught up. Slowly, she moved to the doorway, the spoon still clutched in her hand, and looked out into the clearing. He stood at the edge, just where the trees thinned into meadow, a man of medium build, dressed in clean, dark wool, with boots that had not seen much mud and a satchel that hung too easily over one shoulder. His cloak was clasped with silver, a polished ring on one glove hand. His beard was trimmed, his hair combed back beneath a felt cap. He smiled when he saw her, not wide, not warm, but with the careful calculation of someone used to getting what he wanted. Maris did not move. Her breath lodged itself beneath her ribs. "Forgive the intrusion," he called, voice smooth and unhurried. "I was told there might be a dwelling here. I didn't expect it to be so well kept." She stepped outside, keeping the child on her hip, the spoon now tucked into the crook of her apron. She did not return his smile. "There's nothing for sale here," she said flatly. The man chuckled, as if she'd made a joke. "I'm not here to buy anything, only passing through. I thought I recognized something familiar. You, perhaps." Maris felt the ground tilt slightly beneath her feet. She said nothing. He stepped forward, no longer smiling, his eyes sharp now, watching her with unsettling precision. "You're from Thornwood, aren't you?" he said. "I thought so. You have the same look. You're her daughter, the red-haired woman with the garden. Lilwyn, wasn't it?" Her fingers tightened on Ellen's back. The child stirred against her shoulder, sensing the shift. The man nodded slowly, confirming his own deduction. "It's remarkable. You have her eyes, and the same tendency to disappear." "I don't know you," she said. "No," he agreed. "But I know what happened to you. Word traveled, even out here. The girl who ran from the church, the one they said cast spells in the stream, cursed a priest with fever, seduced a stable boy. You caused quite the stir." He said it without malice, almost with admiration. But it was the admiration of someone who collects strange things in jars, not someone who honors a life they once belonged to. "What do you want?" Maris asked. He held up his hands in mock innocence. "Nothing. Just curiosity. When the village burned, I assumed you'd been lost. Or taken. But here you are. Whole. Living." His gaze flicked to Ellen. And not alone. The way he looked at her child made Maris's stomach twist. There was no fondness in his gaze. Only speculation, the way a man might appraise a rare object or a beast in fine health. She stepped back without realizing it, positioning herself between him and the doorway. "Leave," she said. "There's nothing for you here." He didn't move. "I mean no harm. I'm just trying to understand. Who helped you? A soldier? A deserter?" There was talk of a man traveling these woods. Gray armor, foreign blade. I wonder if he's still around. The threat in the words was veiled, but clear. She did not reply. Finally, he sighed and stepped back, brushing his gloves against his coat as if dusting off dirt that did not exist. "Well, it's a long way back to Thornwood. What's left of it? But you never know who might be interested in news like this." A woman reappeared, with a child who shouldn't exist. People pay attention. With a last lingering glance, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the trees as easily as he had appeared. Maris remained still until the sound of his steps had faded entirely. Then she went inside, bolted the door, and held Ellen so tightly the child began to whimper in confusion. Her own breath came in harsh bursts. The world tilted again, old fear rising like bile. He knew, not everything, but enough to ruin them. When Calred returned that evening, she was still sitting by the hearth, Ellen asleep in her lap. The spoon dropped on the floor beside her. Her face was drawn, pale, her eyes unfocused. He took one look and crossed the room in 3 strides, kneeling beside her. "What happened?" he asked. She told him, every word, every glance, even the ring, blue stone polished, set in a silver band with sigils she had seen before, years ago, on the hand of a man who used to whisper in the priest's ear after Mass. She described the way he smiled, the way he watched Ellen, the way he said her mother's name as though tasting it. Calred's face did not change as she spoke, but a stillness settled into him, cold and deep. When she finished, he stood, walked to the door, and unhooked his sword from the wall. He checked the edge, sheathed it, and began to pack a small bundle of supplies. "Where are you going?" she asked, though she already knew. "To find him," he said. "What if he's not alone?" "I don't care." She rose, holding Ellen to her chest, her body tense. "Don't do anything foolish. Please." He turned to her, and for the first time since the day she gave birth, his face held something close to rage. But beneath it was fear, not for himself, for them. "I won't let him bring you back to that place," he said. "I won't let them touch her." She crossed the room and touched his arm. "Then take this," she said, and reached beneath the hearthstone, pulling free the knife she had hidden there months ago. It was small, but sharp, the hilt wrapped in old cloth, just in case. He took it with a nod, slid it into his boot, and kissed her. Not her lips, her forehead, a promise made without ceremony. Then he was gone. That night, she did not sleep. She laid Ellen beside her and watched the fire until it died, and when the darkness crept in, she stared into it, daring it to come closer. The man had not made a threat, but he had left one behind, a promise of return, of interest. And interest in her life had never been a gift. It had always been a warning. She whispered lullabies until her voice gave out. She held her child with arms that no longer trembled. And when the wind rose outside, she did not flinch. She only watched, waiting, ready. The snow fell heavier than it had all season, late and bitter, as if the winter had woken in a fury and come to collect a debt. It layered the trees in silence, muffled the sound of the world, until even the wind moved as if through cloth. By morning, the clearing had become a pale, breathless world, all edges dulled, all colors swallowed in white. Maris watched it from the threshold with Ellen in her arms, the child's breath fogging against her neck. Her hands were steady now, her movements sharp and sure. She did not hum this morning, did not speak. She had not heard from Calred in 2 days. The bundle of kindling by the door had dwindled. The stew pot was almost empty, but she had not lit the signal fire. Not yet. Something in her refused to believe it was time. She had lived in the constant company of fear for too long to mistake its quiet for safety. She knew how it curled in shadows, waited for softness. She could feel it now, watching. Not the forest. No, the forest did not judge. It was older than judgment, but there was a wrongness in the air, as if something foreign had crept between the trees. The birds were gone. Even the foxes had stopped leaving tracks near the lodge. She stayed inside that day, rationing the root mash, melting snow for water, whispering nonsense into Ellen's ear just to keep the child calm. The hours dragged slowly, the sky bruising with storm. Her eyes flicked constantly to the window slits, to the edges of the trees, to the line of footprints that still led away from the lodge. Cards last, pressed deep into old ice. She had not slept the night before. She would not sleep now. It was near dusk when she heard it, the creak of weight on snow. Not many steps, just one, and then another, deliberate and slow, like someone measuring their distance. She stood, took Ellen to the cradle, pressed a kiss to her forehead. Then she crossed to the hearth and lifted the small blade from beneath the basin. Her hand closed around it, knuckles white. She did not light the lamp. The door opened before she could move. Slowly, not kicked, not broken, open with the quiet confidence of someone who believed they had the right. And then he stepped inside. It was the man from before, the one with the blue ring. But he was not alone this time. Behind him came two others, less refined, more plainly dressed, the rough demeanor of men who did not question the orders they were given. They carried blades openly, though not yet drawn. The first man, the one with the ring, removed his gloves slowly, surveying the room as if appraising its worth. His eyes landed on the cradle. "So," he said, his voice smooth and oily, "this is the place." Maris did not move. She did not answer. He turned to her, his expression unreadable. "You've lived well considering. The church always feared you'd be difficult, but it seems domesticity has suited you." She raised the knife slightly, not as threat, but as promise. He laughed softly, still the witchling with thorns. "It's almost admirable." "What do you want?" she asked. "I want what belongs to the church," he said, "what was never yours to keep." He stepped toward the cradle, and she moved to block him, the knife between them. He stopped. "She's just a child," Maris said. "She belongs to no one but herself." He raised his eyebrows, mockingly. "But that's not how the world works, is it? She is proof of blasphemy, of heresy, of what happens when sinners are left unchecked. She is proof of survival." He looked past her, and she knew then he was not here to threaten. He was here to take. And if Calred did not return soon, she would stand alone. "Lumensight, this doesn't have to be unpleasant. You can come willingly, and the child will be raised in piety." Or, he didn't finish, because the door burst open again, this time without ceremony. Calred, blood on his cloak, snow in his hair, sword drawn. He did not speak. He crossed the room in a breath, and the two guards moved forward, but not fast enough. The first fell to his knees, a deep wound splitting his side. The second lunged, but Calred met him with a shoulder blow that sent him into the wall, dazed. Only the ringed man did not move, though his face had lost its calm. Calred turned to him, blade raised. "I warned you," he said. The man smiled thinly. So predictable. Soldiers always are. Calred moved, but the man stepped back behind the cradle, drawing a small dagger from his belt. "You kill me and the child dies," he said. Everything stilled. Maris stood frozen, the blade still clutched in her fist. Calred's eyes met hers. For a moment, nothing moved. Then she nodded, barely perceptible. She stepped forward, not toward the man, but toward the cradle. "Let me take her," she said. "She'll scream if you touch her. You don't know how to hold her." The man hesitated. Then he nodded. She reached down, hands slow, gentle. Ellen stirred but did not cry. Maris lifted her carefully, wrapped her close, turned as if to hand her over, and then drove the knife into his side. He gasped, not in pain, but in disbelief. He stumbled back. Calred was on him a moment later. There was no elegance in the death, just finality. When it was done, the room fell silent. The snow outside continued to fall. The fire crackled softly, as if nothing had happened. Calred dropped his sword. Maris still held the child. Neither of them moved for a long time. Then she spoke. He said the church sent him. They won't send another, Calred said. He wasn't sent. He came for himself. For power. For revenge. She looked at the body. He knew my mother. Calred nodded. He knew mine, too. She looked up. What? He sighed. He was the one who denounced her. My mother said she'd harbored heretics, that she'd nursed a dying rebel. They took her in the night. I never saw her again. Something passed between them then, not shock, but recognition. Shared grief. The thread of their stories weaving tighter. They buried the bodies at the edge of the clearing, beneath the frozen roots of an old elder tree. Calred said a name for each, even the ones who had come to kill, not out of forgiveness, but out of completeness, as if to mark that it was over. That night they did not sleep. They lay together by the hearth, Ellen between them. The snow piled high against the door, sealing them in. But for the first time, Maris felt no fear. The threat had come and passed, and she had not broken. She had stood, she had protected, and she had not stood alone. The snow did not stop for 3 more days, falling in silent sheets that buried the world in white, muffling even the breath of the trees. From inside the lodge, the wind could be heard only in distant moans, as if the forests were sighing in sleep, and the windows grew dim with frost until the inside and outside ceased to feel like part of the same world. Time slowed to a rhythm set by firewood and hunger, by the long hush of days without visitors, without voices beyond the small circle of 3. Maris felt the weariness settle into her bones differently now, not as dread but as a kind of aftermath. The echo of adrenaline turned to heaviness. Her hands no longer trembled when she held the knife, but her body ached with the strain of what she had done, and what she had chosen not to regret. The death had not shaken her in the way she once imagined killing might. It had clarified her. The man's blood had soaked into the floorboards and left a scent that clung long after the stains were scrubbed clean. But what lingered more deeply was not the horror. It was a sharp, quiet knowledge that she would do it again if it came to that, and without hesitation. Calred said little in those days. He chopped wood and mended the latch on the door, boiled snow for water, and reinforced the shutter hinges. He moved carefully, favoring his left side, where a dark bruise now bloomed from the rib he had taken a blow to. He refused Maris's attempt to tend it beyond binding it tightly with clean cloth. But when she left a poultice of comfrey and crushed pine bark beside his bedding, she found it used the next morning, empty and rinsed. He had not thanked her aloud, but he had begun speaking to Ellen in the quiet mornings, when he thought Maris was asleep. He told the child about wolves and stars, about the names of trees, and the way rivers change shape over time, about the sounds arrows made when they missed. It was not tenderness in the traditional sense. It was deeper, older, a kind of reverent honesty. And though Ellen could not understand the words, she listened as if she did, her small hands sometimes reaching for the rhythm of his voice. Maris did not press him to speak of what he had seen in Thornwood, or what he had done before returning. She could see the lines in his face had deepened, as if he had aged a year in those missing days. And though he bore no new scars that she could find, there was a shadow behind his gaze that had not been there before. She recognized it. It was a look of someone who had chosen to leave a part of themselves buried where no one would dig it up, and she did not ask him to unearth it. But she began to speak more freely of her own past, not all at once, not in confession, but in fragments, folded into the fabric of quiet days. One morning, as she brushed Ellen's hair with her fingers, she said aloud that her mother used to braid hers with threads of rosemary and lavender. She told Calred that when she was 7, she'd seen a deer give birth in a clearing near Thornwood, and that for weeks after, she'd woken each morning believing in small miracles. She admitted she used to dream of being a healer, not a mother, that she had once read a book in secret from the convent library about herbs that could draw the fever out of blood, and for years afterward had remembered the pages by heart even after forgetting the title. Calred listened. He never interrupted, never asked for more than she gave. Sometimes he nodded, Sometimes he made no sound at all, but she could feel his presence as something steady, something unmoved by the unraveling of her truths. One afternoon, as the snow began to melt in slow drips from the eaves, he disappeared for a few hours without explanation. Maris felt a flicker of old anxiety rise in her chest when she noticed, but it passed quickly. He had left the sore behind. His boots were still drying by the hearth, and his cloak remained on its hook. He had not left. He had gone somewhere nearby. When he returned, his hands were cold and covered in damp dirt. She watched in silence as he stepped to the table, unwrapped a piece of oilcloth, and revealed what he had retrieved, a ring. Not the blue ring man's, but one much older, tarnished by time, the band bent slightly at the edge. Calred turned it in his fingers once, then set it down and looked at her. "It was my brother's," he said. "He gave it to me the last day we fought together. Said I should pass it on to someone who would remember his name." Maris stared at the ring. "Tehran." Calred nodded. "He was younger than me. Braver. Foolish, maybe. He believed in things longer than I did." She reached out, touched the ring lightly, then withdrew her hand. "You haven't given away before?" "There was no one to give it to," he said. "Until now." He did not name who he meant. He didn't need to. She picked up the ring and held it in her palm for a long time. Then, without asking, she threaded it through a length of ribbon and tied it around her neck, letting it rest just above her heart. Calred didn't speak. But something between them shifted then, not broken, not remade, only confirmed. She had buried a man with her knife, and he had offered her the only piece of his past he had kept. Neither of them needed to name what that meant. The snow continued to melt. Slowly, the forest began to return to itself. Maris heard the first real birdsong in weeks, a sharp lark call from the west side of the clearing. The soil underfoot turned to mud, rich and dark, and the small path to the stream became passable again. She carried Ellen there in the sling Calred had reinforced with leather ties, and she bathed the child in the shallow waters, whispering blessings not in the language of any god, but in the names of flowers: daisy, marigold, ashleaf, columbine. Ellen squealed and kicked her feet, her laugh echoing through the trees like a chime. When Maris looked up, she saw Calred leaning against a tree nearby, watching them with that same quiet, unreadable expression. Not joy, not longing, just presence. That night, Maris dreamed of her mother. She stood at the edge of the garden in Thornwood, her hands covered in dirt, a sprig of rue behind her ear. She said nothing, only smiled as Maris approached with Ellen in her arms. Then she knelt and kissed the child's forehead, her lips leaving no mark, just warmth. When Maris woke, there was a single violet blooming near the edge of the hearth. Its petals curled a hole, growing in a crack between the stones. Spring had come. The forest no longer held its breath. It exhaled, and in that breath, Maris felt something release in herself. Not grief. That would stay. But guilt. The sense that she did not deserve this small, quiet life. It faded. She had bled in the snow. She had killed for her child. She had built something with her own hands and asked nothing from the world in return but to be left alone. And still, she had been seen and chosen and protected. That, too, was real. And though no vows had been spoken and no ceremony performed, when she fell asleep with Ellen nestled between them, and Card's hand resting near hers on the furs, she knew with a certainty deeper than anything she had learned in the chapel or on the road. She was not alone anymore. By the time the trees had begun to thicken again with green, when the first real heat pressed itself into the forest air and the scent of thawed loam turned sweet beneath the sun, the clearing had changed. Not in great, sudden ways, but slowly, with the patience of things that grow in silence. The garden behind the lodge had begun to flourish beneath Maris's care. The bed she once scratched it in cold hope now swelled with herbs, with tight green shoots of garlic and slender vines that curled around their wooden frames. A row of wildflowers she hadn't planted lined the edge of the plot, sprung up like a quiet offering from the forest itself. Inside the lodge, the walls had been reinforced with another layer of bark and moss, the floor scrubbed clean of old ash, the shelves lined with glass jars of foraged things, dried berries, teas, poultices, roots she had crushed into powder with a flat of stone. Ellen had begun to walk with the hesitancy of someone learning the earth could be trusted beneath her feet, and Maris followed her with both pride and fear. letting her stumble and fall, letting her rise again. The child had hair now, the soft down giving way to copper curls that reminded Maris of her mother, though the eyes remained her own, gray, solemn, wise in a way that still startled her. Calred had built a fence, not out of suspicion, but out of care, a circle of felled wood, low enough not to close him in, high enough to keep the child from wandering too far. He'd made it with a blunt axe and bare hands, splitting the logs by firelight, fitting them together like bones into a rib cage. Maris had watched him from the garden, Ellen on her hip, and said nothing until it was finished. When he tied the last lash with leather and stepped back, hands on his hips, sweated his brow, she walked over and kissed his cheek without warning. He had turned to her with a look that was not surprise, but something gentler, acceptance maybe, or a kind of tired joy, and nodded once, as if to say, yes, this is what we do now. We build things we do not plan to leave behind. They spoke of the future more often now, though never in grand terms. There were no maps drawn, no imagined homes beyond the trees. But they began to name the parts of their world, to give language to the places they shared. Maris called the southern bend of the stream the Washing Curve. Calred named the ash tree near the lodge's edge the Watchman. When Ellen pointed and babbled, they repeated her sounds until they formed words, until her voice began to shape the rhythm of their days. They did not speak of Thornwood anymore, not because it was forgotten, but because it no longer held power. The fire had come and gone. What was left could not burn again. One morning, after a night of rain that had soaked the soil and left the lodge smelling of earth and sap, Maris rose early and walked into the clearing with her arms bare and her feet wet. The sun had not yet lifted above the trees, but light filtered to the mist in golden strands, and for a moment she stood perfectly still, listening to the sound of birdsong and dripping leaves and her own slow breath. She walked to the old tree at the edge of the garden, the one with the gnarled trunk that had sheltered them in their first month, and pressed her palm to the bark. Then, without ceremony, she knelt and picked up a stone. Flat, smooth, dark gray. She scratched the blade of her small carving knife against it, and when that proved too dull, she turned to the base of the tree where a scrap of slate had been buried in the roots. She pulled it free, sat on her heels, and began to carve. The first name she carved was Ellen's. Deep, curved letters, a child's name, strong and full of breath. Then just beneath it, she carved her own, not the name the priest had spat from the altar, not the one the townswomen hissed like a warning. Just Maris, clean and true. And last, she carved Calred. She did not ask his permission. She did not need to. These were their names now, etched into bark, not as a claim over the land, but as a record. We lived here. We made something here. We endured. Later that day, Calred found her there, sitting at the base of the tree with shavings in her lap, and Ellen playing the grass beside her, the child fascinated by a trail of ants winding through the moss. He saw the names and did not speak. He only reached down, took her hand, and pressed something into her palm. It was the ring. She had worn it for months now on a ribbon around her neck, letting it rest against her heart like a talisman. But this time, he handed it to her differently, not as memory, as offering. She looked up at him. His face was sun-lined and quiet. He said nothing, but she saw the meaning in his eyes. He did not speak of vows. They had no priest, no altar, no need. They had the tree, the fence, the child between them, the lodge they had built from ruin. She slid the ring onto her thumb, where it sat loose but firm, and nodded. Not a yes, but a knowing. We are bound. That is enough. That night, they lay together with Ellen asleep between them, the child's small foot resting on Maris's ribs, her breath even and shallow. Calred reached across and took Maris's hand, twined his fingers through hers, and for the first time he spoke of something he wanted. "I've been thinking," he said. "There's a stream further west. Saw it once when I tracked that wounded buck last season. Good fishing, flat land. Could clear it, build something there." Maris turned to him, their hands still joined. "You want to leave this place?" He shook his head. "No, just grow. Make more." She smiled. "You want to build another lodge?" He shrugged. Maybe a barn. Maybe a place where she can run, without us watching every step. Maris looked at Ellen. Her face in sleep was peaceful, a slight crease at her brow, as if even in dreams she studied the world. She thought her own childhood, of narrow hallways and whispers, of kitchens she was not allowed to enter, of stories she was never permitted to finish. Then she looked back at Calred and said, "Yes." The next morning, they began to map it, with sticks in the dirt and lines traced by footstep. They marked where the sun fell and where the trees shaded. Ellen sat in the grass nearby, babbling to a beetle on her knee, and Maris thought, this is what legacy feels like. Not grand, not spoken of in taverns or carved in stone. Just daily gentle work. Just laughter where there once was silence. Just the naming of a place with hands and memory. That evening, as they finished their stew and the fire crackled low, Maris took out a piece of cloth she had been saving. Linen from an old shirt, dyed pale blue from boiled wildflowers. She had stitched it in secret, piece by piece, a square each night. On it she had sewn a tree, a stream, a cradle, a ring. And beneath it, 3 names, Ellen, Maris, Calred. She handed it to him without a word. He looked at it for a long time before folding it with care and placing it beside the hearth. They did not speak of forever, but they built toward it one moment at a time. And in the hush of the forest, with dusk pressing gentle against the windows, Maris no longer feared being seen. She only feared being forgotten, and that, too, was fading. The seasons continued to turn with quiet insistence, their rhythm now familiar, like the breath of an old animal sleeping at the edge of the hearth. Spring ripened into summer, and summer wore itself out in golden exhaustion, giving way to the bruised softness of autumn. The forest around the lodge thickened and shifted, but never threatened. It became a part of them as they became part of it, not as masters or trespassers, but as those who listened and learned. The fence Calred had built was no longer a boundary but a frame, something that held their small world in place as it expanded in slow, measured ripples. The stream to the west, once only an idea, now wound past a new patch of cleared land where poles had been raised and a simple roof stretched across rough-hewn beams. It was not yet finished, but it stood, and that was enough. Each night, Maris and Calred marked its progress not with declarations, but with touch, with a shared glance across the fire, with a hand brushed against his shoulder, with the silence that now passed between them like language. Ellen grew, not in sudden leaps, but in the way roots do, quiet, determined, always seeking. Her legs lengthened, her speech sharpened, her curiosity took on a form both endearing and relentless. She asked questions from the moment she opened her eyes to the moment they closed again, and when her words failed her, she made up her own, drawing pictures in the dirt to explain what her tongue had not yet learned. Maris watched her daughter with a kind of wonder she had never expected to feel, not because the girl was extraordinary in the eyes of the world, but because she was whole. She had been born in fear and snow, in blood and silence, and yet she now moved through the world as though it belonged to her. That, Maris knew, was a miracle. Not the kind of miracle they spoke of in sermons or scrawled on chapel walls, but the kind found in the ordinary pulse of a life reclaimed. Each year, on the morning when the first frost clung to the grass like a secret, Maris returned to the hemlock grove. She did not go out of nostalgia, nor out of some need to suffer the memory. She went because that place had held the beginning, the ache and the terror and the birth. She brought Ellen with her the second year, and the child toddled to the brittle ferns, touching the bark, asking where the stars had gone. Maris pointed upward and said, "They're still there, just waiting." When Calred joined them on the third year, he brought with him a blanket and a simple meal, and they sat beneath the same tree that had once borne witness to her pain. No one spoke of what had happened there. It was enough to sit, to eat, to listen to the wind, to the branches that had once shielded them from snow. It was enough to breathe. Maris no longer woke to the sound of footsteps in her dreams. The shadow of the church had receded, not vanished, but dulled, like an old wound that no longer dictated the pace of her life. She still remembered the priest's face, the words he had spoken, the way the village women had looked through her as though she were already a ghost. But the memory no longer owned her. When she knelt now, it was not to beg, it was to plant. She knelt in earth and moss, pressing seeds into soil, whispering their names like blessings, her hands strong and her back upright. She prayed, perhaps in her own way, but to no God she had ever been taught. She prayed to roots, to wind, to fire that did not burn, to water that did not judge. One evening, years after the first snow, Maris stood in the doorway of the lodge with her hands wrapped around a cup of warm cider. Calred sat nearby, sharpening the blade of a new axe, and Ellen ran barefoot through the dusk, chasing a rabbit she would never catch. The air was thick with the scent of pine and early apples. The sound of her daughter's laughter drifted across the clearing like birdsong. Maris did not speak. She only watched. In her chest, there was a fullness that frightened her in its gentleness. She had learned to live so long with hunger and fear that the presence of peace still startled her sometimes. But she did not run from it. She stood in it, as one might stand in light after a long night. Later that night, after Ellen had been tucked into her bed with a half-worn doll and a story whispered into her hair, Maris sat with Calred near the hearth, the fire low and steady. He was older now. The gray in his beard had deepened, the lines at the corners of his eyes more defined. But the strength in him remained, quieter now, less urgent, but rooted. She looked at him, the man who had once stepped from the trees with nothing but a sword and silence, and felt the weight of everything they had not needed to say. He looked back at her with the same stillness, and then, without rising, without breaking the quiet, he said, "If you'd asked me that first night why I stayed." She waited. He smiled faintly, then shook his head. "I wouldn't have known how to answer. Not then. And now." He did not answer immediately. He leaned forward, tossed a small log onto the fire, and watched as the flame caught and grew. Then he looked back at her and said, "Now, I stay because I have a life here. Not a debt, not a duty. A life." She nodded because it was the truth and because it was also hers. Then she reached into the small chest beside the hearth and withdrew a bundle wrapped in old linen. She unfolded it slowly, revealing a square of cloth. The embroidery had faded slightly over time, but the lines were still clear. A tree, a stream, a cradle, a ring. And beneath them, the names. She handed it to him again, and he laid it across his knees, smoothing the fabric with callous fingers. "I want her to know," Maris said, her voice soft but certain, "where she came from, what we chose." He met her eyes. "She will." The years did not slow after that, but they passed with gentleness. The new lodge was completed, with a loft where Ellen kept her books and feathers and the small treasures she collected from the woods. A new clearing was planted and the garden expanded. Travelers passed now and then, some on foot, some on cart. A few were wounded, some hungry, others only lost. Maris offered food and a place to rest. Calred taught those who asked how to bind a blade or patch a roof. Not all stayed, but some did for a season or two. A woman with a broken arm and a broken voice. A boy who had never seen snow. A man who left his sword at the threshold and never took it up again. The lodge became more than a home. It became a place of return. Ellen grew into a fierce, bright girl with wind-tangled hair and a mind like flint. She asked questions that made Maris pause, that made Calred smile behind his beard. She learned to climb trees before she could spell her name, to split wood before she could write it. But she read everything. Old books salvaged from ruined abbeys, scrolls brought by travelers, the stories her mother stitched into cloth. She learned about fire and healing, about the names of stars and the weight of choices. When she was 12, she carved her own name beneath the tree, not beside theirs, but just below, a new line, a continuation. One day, when the wind blew warm and the garden smelled of mint and tomato, Ellen came to her mother and asked, "Will they ever come for us again?" Maris looked at her daughter for a long time before answering. "No," she said, "and if they do, they'll find we are not the same." That night, long after Ellen had fallen asleep, Maris stepped outside into the clearing. The moon was high, and the trees whispered softly. She walked barefoot through the grass, the dew cool against her skin, and stopped at the tree where her name was carved. She traced the letters with her fingertips, then knelt and placed a hand over the earth. This was where it began, not in fire, not in exile, not in pain. Here, in soil, in breath, in choice. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in years, she whispered a prayer, not to any god, but to the child she had once been, to the woman who had walked bleeding through snow, to the man who had knelt without asking, to the life they had made, quiet and unremarked by history, but true. And when she rose, the wind rose with her. It carried nothing but the sound of leaves, and the promise that they had never needed to be saved, only seen, only chosen, only loved when the world turned away.